Okay, it's 6:04, so how about we get going? So I'm your host, Miriam, and as hopefully we all know, this is the Cross-Pollinations event series, last Wednesday of every month. And today our kind of wide theme is on sleep, with Sandra Huber. So am I pronouncing your last name right? Huber?
Yeah, Huber.
Huber.
Yeah.
Who I stumbled upon her book, Assembling the Morrow, Poetics of Sleep, which is from 2014, but I thought fits perfectly with Amala's work in her doctoral research on sleep paralysis. And I thought this was a really interesting theme just because sleep is obviously related, is like such an important part of health and also illness. Sleep often gets so disturbed when we are sick or disabled or dealing with life stressors. Um, and yet it's also not often a topic in the health humanities, at least. So to start off, I want to do a little land acknowledgement that we are on, sorry, I'm just gonna change the page we're on. So we're virtual, of course, so everyone's kind of coming from their different places, but where the League of Canadian Poets is situated is on the territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, as well as now Toronto and the GTA more generally being home to many urban, Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people from all over. And what I thought I would do is actually open with a poem. I probably should have organized this a bit better, but I just wanted to have it up here so everyone can see. This is our event. This is not what we wanted. Okay. I wanted to start with a poem by an Indigenous poet who wrote about sleep back in 1912. I thought that would be kind of fitting. And her name is Emily Pauline Johnson, and she's actually pretty foundational early writer in terms of Canadian Indigenous women's writing, or Indigenous women's writing on Turtle Island. So I'll just quickly read this poem out loud. Little brown baby bird, lapped in your nest, wrapped in your nest, strapped in your nest. Your straight little cradle board rocks you to rest. Its hands are your nest, its bands are your nest. It swings from the down-bending branch of the oak. You watch the camp flame and the curling gray smoke. But oh, for your pretty black eyes, sleep is best. Little brown baby of mine, go to rest. Little brown baby bird swinging to sleep, winging to sleep, singing to sleep. Your wonder black eyes that so wide open keep, shielding their sleep, unyielding to sleep. The heron is homing, the plover is still, the night owl calls from his haunt on the hill. Afar the fox barks, afar the stars peep, little brown baby of mine, go to sleep. So without further ado, I'll pass it along to Sandra and Amala.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, I'm hoping that we will have a very collaborative conversation today because Sandra and I have been in touch for the last few weeks talking about all things sleep, and it's just been the most fabulous and insightful, generative conversation for us. So I'll just dive right in. The work I'm sharing today is based on my PhD dissertation, which is in its penultimate stages now. And I'm interested in examining sleep paralysis as an affective, embodied experience, which is symptomatic of literary and visual culture's preoccupation with the modern sleep crisis. So I'll start by just laying out what I'm planning to do. I'll talk a bit about what the sleep crisis itself is and briefly define sleep paralysis, then try to situate sleep paralysis as a symptom of the sleep crisis and go back a little ways into the 19th century to look at a small excerpt from Le Horla, a short story by Guy de Maupassant, which is a kind of landmark text where sleep paralysis is articulated for the first time in literature in that specifically tonal narrative format, and then discuss why a health humanities approach could be useful to study the condition before passing it on to Sandra with some questions about terminology. So what is the sleep crisis, right? There are debates about whether or not we are in fact in a sleep crisis, or if the idea of our sleep as being different is exaggerated in the 21st century. So Diletta de Cristofaro defines the sleep crisis as the notion that our modern society chronically struggles with a lack of sleep, end quote. As we know, less sleep is associated with an increase in sleep disorders, which in turn lead to a host of ailments. And Matthew Walker's recent work in Why We Sleep, published in 2017, examines the complex role of sleep in evolution and the multiple benefits of sleep, sort of starting a call to sleeping guiltlessly, and which we now see echoed in movements about rest as resistance. So such research emerging from the cognitive sciences in combination with social sciences shows that the sleep crisis is a public health problem, further exacerbated by COVID-19. And researchers have examined the pandemic's effects on public health in the form of increased anxiety, poorer boundaries between work and rest, and a greater struggle to get adequate sleep. But though the pandemic has added a greater urgency and scrutiny to the effects on sleep, the question of a sleep crisis pre-exists COVID-19, and I'll argue that it goes as far back as the 19th century, and we are perhaps not the first ones to experience the sleep crisis. And as you see up here, there's some sensational language in Nature about how sleep pathologies are reaching epidemic levels. And this sensationalism makes its way into news articles conveying scientific data about sleep debt and its relationship to fatigue, anxiety, and productivity. Critics such as Simon J. Williams, Jim Horn, or Lee Scribner argue against the sleep crisis by examining the perception of sleep as an urgent health concern from a historical and sociological perspective. What I'm seeking to argue here is that contemporary literature and culture are necessary sites of evidence for attitudes about a global sleep crisis. And this happens in two ways: through the use of sleeping disorders as plot motifs in visual media representations, or through speculative fictions about sleepless or dreamless societies. So this is a painting by Henry Fuseli called The Nightmare in 1781, and it's kind of the most landmark association with sleep paralysis even today. The picture of the hag on the chest, or the presence on the chest, typically represents that sense of a pressure or the chest tightening while someone is experiencing sleep paralysis. Just to briefly define it, sleep paralysis is a state of awareness between sleeping and waking, where the sleeper feels as though they're stuck, and it's a different kind of consciousness. It's not unconsciousness, and it's not as the same as being fully awake. It's a kind of traumatic return to the corporeal body from unconsciousness of sleep, and the individual might find themselves unable to move, terrified, and possibly certain of any number of uncanny visual or auditory presences in their surroundings. So one of the main features is that it feels as though the presence in the room is real, and people can insist on the fact that there was an entity in the room, even after hearing about the scientific explanations for why they may have felt that way. So it offers an opportunity to study, quote, the stilled body of sleep and the mystery of the corpse, as Drew Letter puts it. Statistically, about 1/3 of the population has experienced or will experience a form of sleep paralysis at some point in their lives. And this suggests a familiarity and an ubiquity to the experience that makes the coexistence of paranormal explanations with scientific ones particularly rich for analysis. So even experiences of a single time occurrence of sleep paralysis are often reported to be extremely memorable and traumatic. So how does sleep paralysis appear as a symptom of the sleep crisis? right? So this phenomenon has long been used in horror cinema through manifestations of in the form of possessions, witches, demons, and other supernatural beings. And this points not only to the way that sleep paralysis manifests in narratives at nighttime, but to a kind of fissure in knowledge between sleep medicine and the so-called natural and supernatural divide. So recent films such as Z, Get Out, and Lights Out, also TV shows such as The Haunting of Hill House, show how the boundary of sleep paralysis straddles something supernatural and an uncanny presence in the room. And in many of these horror films, often the presence is accessible only to children at the start before it envelopes the whole household and becomes a kind of infestation into and beyond the boundary of sleep, spilling past nightmares into everyday life. What I seek to argue in my work is that sleep paralysis is making a resurgence in current visual culture as a manifestation of our preoccupation around sleep and our anxieties around insufficient sleep, just as it did in 19th century literature in texts such as Jekyll and Hyde, Dracula, The Great Pot Ban, and the text that we'll look at now. So what I'd like to do here is just look at the passage from Guy de Maupassant's Les Horla, which was published in 1887, and see how literature is in a kind of dialogue with medicine and creating its own experiment around sleep paralysis. And I take this story as evidence of slippages between disciplines where sleep paralysis has always been theorized, studied, and explained, to see why a health humanities approach can be useful in realigning the dialogue between disciplines, which currently informs what we think of sleep paralysis. So in 1842, physician Edward Binns produced the first report of symptoms seen in isolated sleep paralysis during a daytime nap, and he referred to them as daymares instead of the opposite of nightmares, calling it an utter incapacity for motion or speech, difficult respirations, and extreme dread. And in the Philosophy of Sleep, a famous text by Macnish calls it a scholarly account of sleep which may have depicted sleep paralysis in a nightmare, referring to Guy de Maupassant's Les Horla. So this is one of the first texts in which there's a scholarly and yet fictional account of sleep paralysis which happens. So I'll just read out a couple of sentences and then move to an analysis of it. As the evening comes on, an incomprehensible feeling of disquietude seizes me. I dine quickly and then try to read, but I do not understand the words and can scarcely distinguish the letters. Then I walk up and down my drawing room, oppressed by a feeling of confused and irresistible fear, a fear of sleep and a fear of my bed. Then I go to bed and I wait for sleep as a man might wait for the executioner. I wait for its coming with dread, and my heart beats and my legs tremble, while my whole body shivers beneath the warmth of the bedclothes, until the moment when I start to fall asleep as a man throws himself into a pool of stagnant water in order to drown. I do not feel this perfidious sleep coming over me as I used to, but a sleep which is close to me and watching me, which is going to seize me by the head, to close my eyes and annihilate me. So there's this description that Anne Carson uses in her essay on sleep, which mirrors this idea of an incognito sleep, where sleep is watching itself, which is one of the most fascinating things about sleep paralysis, because there is no other, there is no entity, but it's a kind of sleep looking at itself, which is a very hard idea to grapple with. And it's still something that I'm still thinking about and could use help unpacking as well. So in this particular passage, the protagonist experiences sleep paralysis every night. This is just one of the earliest descriptions of it. And his days are spent in a state of trepidation and anxiety about the impending crisis of the night. So Maupassant's use of suspense functions to express the anticipation of dread, which is one symptom of sleep paralysis. And the narrator exposes the fact that the anticipation and the fear around sleep paralysis is just as terrifying as the waking state of the paralysis, which lasts for perhaps a few minutes or seconds, depending on the sleeper. And the increasing instability of the narrator draws attention to itself as the story progresses. encouraging the reader to believe that the demon or presence that visits the protagonist is a real entity. So this is also a way of validating that experience of the fear and the anxiety around sleep paralysis, making the entity not a figment of the imagination. So story kind of leaves it ambiguous as to whether or not there was something in the room. And the building tension, the narrator's unreliable sanity make this text one of the first shifts away from a cultural approach to understanding the nightmare, hyphenated across various contexts, to a psychological study of an individual mind. And the dread is analogous to, as we saw, waiting for an executioner in its intensity of terror. So this is the fact that that kind of narrative description doesn't exist in a diagnostic criteria around REM sleep. I think that's quite significant in what literature can do for the affective possibilities of sleep paralysis. The first-person narration and the repetition of sleep paralysis through multiple journal entries pose problems for the attempt to capture this experience. The fragmentary episodic form disrupts the continuity of sleep, and it creates an experiment in literature that mirrors everyday life in its circadian rhythms. So the narrative itself is a kind of scientific experiment that expresses and simultaneously diagnoses irregularities within circadian rhythms, framing them as biological and supernatural in the same account. So one of the things that literature and visual culture promise then is this openness to having the coexistence of the biological and supernatural, so not being afraid to embrace that aspect of the experience which culture has expressed across the Kanashibari in Japan, the old hag in Newfoundland, the conceptions of in Inuit culture of sleep paralysis, none of which fit what we today call sleep paralysis strictly, but overlap in some ways. And a health humanities approach can de-hierarchize knowledge systems and put these various cultural modes of understanding on the same line, bringing in narratives that allow for individual subjectivity to have more room and for that feeling that the experience was real, to reconcile embodied affects from narrative. And that in turn hopefully will enable a study of why sleep paralysis continues to remain undisciplined in some ways. So with that, I will pass it to Sandra to ask the question of what do you think about terminology when it comes to sleep paralysis, and how does your own experience with it fit or not fit with the scientific descriptions, and anything else that you may want to talk about with the difficult problem of naming sleep paralysis.
Great, thank you so much, Amala. That gives me so much to think about. And I'm just going to similarly share my screen. So yes, Amala and I have been talking a lot about sleep paralysis because this is something that I've also experienced. And I do think the terminology around sleep paralysis is really interesting. And really, like, the term sleep paralysis itself, I feel, doesn't give us like the full breadth of what that experience is, like as a horrifying experience in which supernatural entities do come into your purview. And I'm going to talk about, I'm going to connect to sort of what you were saying about sleep crises and language and narrative as I go into this work that I did in Lausanne from 2010 to 2014, in which I did really experience this crisis of sleep in a couple ways. This wasn't necessarily sleep paralysis, though I have experienced it. This work is more about insomnia as a crisis, and also just about the crisis of trying to turn sleep and trying to sort of translate sleep into the waking world by using language. Right, in 2010, I received a residency via this organization called Artists in Lab Switzerland to work as a writer in residence, or as a poet in residence, at the sleep laboratories of Mehdi Tafti and Paul Frankton at the Center for Integrative Genomics in Lausanne, Switzerland. And it resulted in this book, Assembling the Morrow Poetics of Sleep, which is how Miriam found me and how I'm here. So thank you for inviting me to talk about this project, which was really which really like gripped me and then also led me into all these strange rabbit holes of consciousness. So in this project, I was attempting to interface the electricity of the brain in sleep with words. So in short, to combine two very different sets of transcription, sleep data and waking data. And in this case, a very long poem that I wrote in neural oscillations of my own sleeping brain, using a text editor app that I co-designed with a programmer, Manolis Polka. So the residency was through an organization called Swiss Artisan Labs, which obviously is a Swiss foundation. And every year it puts 4 artists into 4 different laboratories in Switzerland. I applied to go to a sleep laboratory because I've always been fascinated with sleep. And I was surprised to get in because usually they pick visual artists. And this is one of the first times that they had a poet come into the lab or someone working with language. So for 9 months, I worked side by side with biologists and neuroscientists and sleep technicians who were working on various problems in the science of sleep. And I immersed myself in the laboratory. I attended all meetings. I read all the articles that my colleagues read. I attended classes. I learned from the technicians how to score sleep in mice and then how to score sleep in human brains and bodies. Also at their sister lab at the hospital, where they took patients, which I will speak more about in a second. So when I started to learn about scoring sleep, and I'm not going to get into it too heavily, but basically you learn how to read neural oscillations as if they were phrases, and you learn how to read signatures and then apply them to the 5 stages of sleep. In the 5 stages of sleep that are known about, most of them being non-REM sleep and one of them being REM sleep, which is of course the type of sleep that is most associated with dreaming. So I noticed, I was really intrigued by this polysomnography. So you can see the electrosomnography here. So polysomnography just means all of these indications you can see on the left. And I was most interested in the electrosomnography of the brain. But it was interesting to me, I suppose, because you normally don't think of sleep, say, as a visual thing, right? Sleep is a behavior. Sleep is something that our bodies do. But in science, of course, everything is an object. So I was interested in how science made sleep visible through these traces. So I've always been interested in the creation of secret languages and languages that you can't read or languages that are invented. And EEG data to me looked like a secret language, or like asemic writing. So here's a visual by Hans Berger, who discovered electroencephalography side by side with the work of a poet, Mirta Dermisash, who's working with asemic writing. So I immediately went about trying to learn this whole other language of gamma, delta, sigma, theta, alpha, that makes up the particular electroencephalography patterns of different stages of sleep. I needed to know what they stood for in the symbolic order of the science of sleep. And I mean, I didn't have to do this as part of my residency, but I got into it. I got a little obsessed with it. And at the time, I was also surprised to find out how little scientists, and I mean biologists, neuroscientists, all kinds of scientists actually know about the function of sleep. So we spend 1/3 of our lives asleep, and we don't really know for certain why we need to spend such a big chunk of sleep a night, a chunk of time a night in sleep. And I can talk about this more if you're interested. As I was working at the lab, I also was confronted with myself as an outsider during that time. So the scientists who I worked beside every day knew that I was working as an artist and not a scientist. So I was really this kind of strange component in the lab. For example, I'd get singled out at meetings in funny ways, or I'd get asked sometimes if I was a journalist or an anthropologist who was studying them, which I felt a little bit like sometimes. And this relationship made me think a lot about the relationship between the outside and the inside, which sleep really makes us think about, like what is the outside of waking? What is the inside of consciousness, for example? This constant sense of outsidedness that I myself had also made me feel closer to sleep. It made me think that perhaps we don't understand sleep because we approach it as wakers, as people who are waking. So I endeavored to get inside of sleep. So I went to the lab at the hospital and got hooked up to polysomnography. So it's taboo in biology to be your own subject. But here it felt odd to take the data of another's sleep. So I became both researcher and participant in my own experiment. I entered sleep. I not only did that, but in entering sleep, I sort of became my own character so that I was a researcher and participant and author and character in this project. So I stayed overnight at the hospital to get my sleep signals. And the sleep clinic, if you've ever been in one, for anyone here who's ever been slept overnight at a sleep clinic, is really like this panopticon of the state of sleep. So here, sleep, or the pathology of sleep rather, is highly surveilled and highly mediated. So this is a typical somnologica screen that a night nurse would see outside of your room if you were in one of these rooms, which you can see here. You have the video of me in the room and also the data of my body. So in collaboration with the programmer Amala Poli, we created this sleep app called Sleep Writer. So I took the data from sleeping overnight at the sleep lab, and we created this text app so that I could put these signals into words. And here I wasn't interested in clarifying these signals, nor was I writing out dreams here. I was interested in getting inside this sort of mystery of sleep and getting comfortable there rather than trying to bring it to the light of day. And this is really where I did have this crisis of sleep, because the more I found that I was trying to write sleep and get into sleep, the more I found sleep was pushing me away. And I started to develop really intense insomnia while I was at the sleep lab. And so I was in this situation where I was like working amongst all these sleep scientists, working with sleep, and then like on all these insomnia pills and like really not able to sleep. So I really did find that writing sleep, there is this, there's something really interesting about language and sleep, no matter how we approach it, where language somehow just can't get in. And this becomes a crisis itself. And I see this also, like, say, with sleep paralysis, and we're trying to define it and trying to talk about it. We never quite get there. And I don't think that's uninteresting. I think it's uninteresting never quite to get there. I think that this develops its own monster. And that's what I was really doing here. In this project was really just trying to develop this monster between the inside and the outside. So I'm not going to go through every stage of sleep, but I developed sort of a different way of writing for each of the 5 stages of sleep. This, for example, is N2 sleep. Yeah, just for a note on sleep stages, if you have not really familiar with sleep stages, in 1953, a grad student named Eugene Azarinsky discovered REM sleep. And then it became apparent that sleep is not a unitary phenomenon, but is sort of consisting of all these different stages of sleep, right? So we have about 5 different stages of sleep going at this moment. And that also sleep is not like this state of passivity, but is actually extremely active. Sleep is an extremely active way of being. So in my book, I also provide transcriptions for the words, but honestly, again, the transcriptions are kind of illegible. So I wasn't really interested in the legibility. It was important for me actually to not elucidate sleep, because here in this illegibility, one must suspend the compulsions to both read and to understand, just as one must let go every night if we want to go to sleep at all. So through this surrender, an active rather than a passive state is attained, where any kind of knowledge one may glean is outside the regular perimeters of knowledge. So I'm going to leave it there. And I wanted to ask this question to Amala, is how do you think, because you're working with narrative and sleep through memoirs and narrative, is how do you think narrative functions differently than poetry in addressing sleep crises? And is it possible to capture crises of sleep in language, or do other mediums, for example, like film, come closer to a more accurate representation?
Thank you, Sandra. That was such a phenomenal presentation. I mean, just thinking about that relationship between being unable to write sleep and sleep at the same time, that I think that really says something about the incognito sleep, something evasive about it, you know, that when you focus on it, it retreats. I think, yeah, it's a difficult question in some ways. I mean, it's an interestingly complex one because the visual representations, for instance, for me feel quite powerful. As someone who experiences sleep paralysis, I find that something like The Haunting of Hill House, it gives it a sense of being acknowledged, to see the amount of trauma that the protagonist experiences and to see the hallucination in the room. So even though it still leaves it somewhat ambiguous, the question of whether or not there's an entity in the room, it validates it differently than any other kind of medium, perhaps. But language itself, I think, finds itself at a limit when it comes to something like sleep paralysis and possibly other sleep phenomena. Even though it tries, it's in those elisions and in those evasions that you come closer to some understanding of the phenomenon. So I think the absence of that complete meaning is what makes it particularly interesting, and possibly just not having the full picture, even though we believe from other perspectives that there is a full picture, you know. That's how I think of it, at least. Yeah, and I think I have a question for you as well on the next slide, maybe if you move it along. I was just wondering about what you think is missing in the current literature on sleep crises, as someone who brings a different embodied artistic perspective to it, and what aspects would you want to see represented in any of these media, visual, literary, cultural, you know, what would you want to see more?
Yeah, I guess like taking off from your answer about like sleep as like the space of illusion that I really love. I think I would like to see maybe more more interdisciplinary work being done around sleep as a phenomenon that we don't necessarily need to explain through science, but that maybe we could try to experience through other means. Like if we really do need to bring sleep into our waking worlds, which, you know, us people as waking beings, we're very fascinated with gleaning knowledge, and I really think of this as like the knowledge of the day, like just being curious and wanting to know everything. And then, but the knowledge of the night is quite different. And I would like to see more maybe knowledges of the night be developed around sleep, like what kind of experiences does sleep bring us that waking can't bring us? And what happens when maybe we stop trying to explain sleep or figure out the function of sleep, which are all noble endeavors and really interesting, but start just trying to see what it brings us. And I think of, there's a lot of really good work going on around this, not necessarily in literature, but I know Trisha Hersey's Rest is Resistance is really interesting. There's Keith and Mindy Obadiki's Lull, a Sleep Temple, which is an 8-hour durational sound and poetry piece that allows you to sleep during it as well. And yeah, I think I love interdisciplinary work like that tries to sort of bring us closer to what it means to be like sleep, instead of try to sort of see what sleep looks like from a waking perspective.
Absolutely. Maria, maybe I will pass it to you and, you know, let you navigate the other folks in the room, maybe.
Yeah, so just from the chat, and yeah, thank you so much for this. I have so many thoughts. I just never really think that deeply about sleep. So this is really interesting for me personally.